I'm Sophie Coe, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we speak about how Putin is manipulating the global food system into crisis and hear from our reporter in the southern port city of Odessa.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 20th of May, day 86, and today I'm joined by the Telegraph's defence correspondent Dani Sheridan, our economics reporter Louis Ashworth, and we also hear from Colin Freeman, who's currently reporting for the Telegraph from Odessa in Ukraine. Yesterday, Dani told the amazing story of how she found Andy, her dog, while she was out reporting in Ukraine and the efforts that she's gone to bring Andy back. So Dani actually brought Andy into the newsroom today for us all to have a cuddle with. So I'll hand over to Dani and Andy.
Hello. Yes, I've currently got Andy sat on my lap right now as we record this. She's loving meeting all of her esteemed Telegraph colleagues. And I don't know if listeners probably aren't familiar with the layout of the Telegraph, but we have a circle where the editor sits. And she's obviously an ambitious girl because she went straight to the circle to say hi to the editor. So, but yeah, she's it's just lovely to have her here and have her in a safe country. And it's I'm grateful for all the support that the company has shown in bringing her back as well. It's very sweet.
Oh, thanks, Dani. I think we'll pass to you first for the latest updates over the last 24 hours. Can you give us a sense of the biggest stories that have been going down?
So in his nightly address yesterday, President Zelensky basically declared the Donbass region destroyed. He said it was hell, and that wasn't an exaggeration. He said that it is genocide. He's reiterated that, and that there's absolutely no military explanation for what Russia are doing. He described it as just a deliberate attempt to kill as many Ukrainian people as possible, and not just the people, but to destroy houses and social facilities and enterprises, and basically just devastate society as Ukraine knows it. So that was pretty shocking, and it will be interesting to hear from Colin, if we can get him on the line, what the sense is in Odessa, because a lot has been coming out regarding the need to blockade the port there in order to help with the exportation of wheat and grain. We know that Ukraine is considered Europe's breadbasket, but at the moment, lots of grain is just sitting in warehouses rotting because it can't physically leave the country because of this war. Other news that came out overnight was the number of soldiers from the Mariupol Azovstal steel factory who have been taken in as Russian prisoners. That's obviously quite terrifying news. The whole ploy by Putin was to say that it was denazifying Ukraine, and that was his justification for this invasion. And now state media are reporting that it had taken 89 injured soldiers who had Nazi links, and that they were now going to be probed. And they had been plucked from Mariupol. So this it just further feeds into the narrative that Putin has been projecting, that this is all part of him being the saviour for the Ukrainian people from Nazis, which is something he isn't willing to drop. And he's obviously got state media now continuing to perpetuate that line. So I'd say those are kind of two of the big stories, but also it is just to hear Zelensky talk about an area being completely destroyed and describing it as hell and not an exaggeration. really hits home, because even in the areas that the Ukrainians have succeeded in pushing the Russian fighters away, they have still destroyed these regions, these areas, to such an extent that it is going to take years to ever bring them back to even a kind of semblance of what they once were. So, when he says this is not exaggeration, that it's hell, well, yeah, I completely can see that. I mean, even having just been on the ground and gone back into the liberated areas, I mean, they are just building sites effectively now. So it's going to be a really long road for Ukraine to keep rebuilding and bringing itself back to, functioning in the way it did before this all began.
And I would recommend listeners, if they haven't, to tune into our episode yesterday, where Roland Oliphant, who's also in the ground in Ukraine, talked a lot about the Donbass region that's been described by Zelensky today as hell. And he gives a very thorough account of the history of the region and how it's kind of been battered over and over again. Dani, I also wanted to ask you about a story that we've got online today. The medic in Mariupol, who has released footage that seems to show a kind of unbelievable strength of power getting through 15 Russian checkpoints. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think that story just really emphasises the kind of resilience of the Ukrainian people. Coming against 15 checkpoints, coming against odds at every twist and turn, and yet being able to succeed in helping people is kind of just it's symbolic of the whole Ukrainian attitude throughout this war, that even though they're up against everything is against them, and yet they can just continue to power through and succeed, is really remarkable.
Definitely. I wondered if we could pass on now. Dani, you mentioned that Colin has been out in Odessa. Now Colin is here to join us. Can you give us a sense, Colin, of what it's like in Odessa, bearing in mind this weaponisation of the global food supplies that's going on there?
It feels slightly odd being here at the moment. The sun is shining. Odessa, which is normally a holiday resort as well as being a big port, has the feel of a kind of Black Sea Riviera at the moment. There are even people out on the beaches and so on. But down at the main port, which is one of the biggest on the Black Sea, if not the biggest, and the main conduit through which Ukraine exports all its agricultural produce, down there is very little going on. The port has not seen a ship depart since the start of the war on February the 24th. And as Danielle was just saying earlier, that means that vast amounts of grain are piling up at the port. I think it's something like 20 million tons have piled up there in the last 3 months. To put it in perspective, on a normal day, apparently, around 3,000 train carloads, as in like train box cars of grain, arrive at the port every day, which are normally sent off around the world. That has not been happening, and the grain mountain is growing every day. There are concerns that it's rotting. Apparently, it's not rotting quite yet, although it may not be in quite the best condition that it might otherwise have been. But certainly, if this blockade of the port continues, then that is going to be a concern. Of far more concern, though, is the fact that lots of people around the world, especially in some of the world's poorer regions, are not getting the grain that they need to make bread and other food.
And what did those who work in the port have to say about it? I'm guessing many of their staff might have fled. Is it still functioning in any capacity at all, or is it totally shut down?
Not really, no. We went to visit a shipping agent at his offices. His office was empty. He normally has 112 staff. The office next door to him, another shipping agent's office, was likewise empty. Pretty much none of them have been doing anything in terms of port-related business at all. That doesn't mean to say they've been idle, though. a lot of them have been trying to work out a way of rediverting all the produce that normally goes out through the port via the road and rail links that lead you from Ukraine into Romania, Moldova, and Poland. And they are doing their best with that, but they have their work cut out. For a start, the railways are on a different gauge in Ukraine to some of the ones in Europe. So that is a major problem. It takes something like 3 weeks, apparently, to unload one train full of grain from one railway gauge and transfer it onto a train for another one. And the estimates were really that something like, I think, of the 250 million tons of food exports or general exports that Ukraine produces every year, 160 million go out via the sea, and 90 million go out via the land. You can imagine that trying to add another 160 million via the land is just not going to be that easy. One shipping agent I spoke to made the point that we don't have the infrastructure, and even if we did, none of the countries that we're trying to get into have the infrastructure. Plus, it's not the end destination either. Most of this stuff is destined for the Middle East and Africa.
So you've touched on that there, but what areas of the world will this have the gravest impact on? Is it the African nations? Because obviously in the West we've got backups, we've got a relative there's other plans, whereas in those countries like Africa, I'm guessing they're pretty dependent on Ukrainian grain.
Can I actually interject here? Just that I was speaking to Tobias Elwood, the chairman of the Defence Select Committee this morning, and he was referencing the direct impact that this grain problem will have on the cost of living in the UK. So he was saying there's a lot of there's a lot of thought that. Hello.
Sorry guys, we've just got a fire alarm going off.
Okay,
it's an air raid alarm.
This is the reality of war reporting on the ground, is that you will be trying to conduct an interview and then an air raid siren goes off. Solidarity with Colin right now. But I was just saying that it's interesting how that MPs here are literally referencing what is happening with the inability to export grain in Ukraine to the cost of living here. So he was saying that a lot of the focus is on what's happening in North African countries, but it is also very much something that will affect the situation here, that we're seeing the cost of living is rising significantly.
Thanks, Dani. And yeah, solidarity with you, Colin. Hope you're okay. I wondered now whether it's a good time to pass over to Louis for the economic side of this. You've just touched on the cost of living, Dani. Louis, could you give us a sense of just how this emerging crisis has impacted prices and what the impact we could see in terms of stockpiling or the reactions of countries globally?
Hi, Sophie. Sure. And thank you for having me on again. So this is affecting a huge amount of the world. So the United Nations estimate on how big the impact is it's about 1.7 billion people across 100 countries that are in some way having their prices affected by what's going on in Ukraine. So that's obviously energy is a big part of that. Commodity prices in general are a big part of that. And food is a huge part of it. As Dani said earlier, Ukraine and the sort of adjacent area of Russia is one of the breadbaskets of the world. It is hugely arable land. It's been a massive producer of crops going back centuries, and so it's really integral to the world's supply of grain. And obviously, that's important for Europe. Where it's more important for them anywhere is some parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So, for instance, Lebanon imports about 80% of its wheat from Ukraine, Moldova about 80%. Several countries like Qatar, Pakistan, Indonesia all hugely rely on those Ukrainian exports, and will also be relying a lot on exports from Russia as well. Wheat, I would say, is probably the most interesting part of this. So we've seen wheat prices. There's a few different ways to look at wheat prices. There are different markets for wheat. Milled wheat listed in Paris, maybe one of the most relevant ones, is up about 47% this year. If we look at prices in Chicago, they're up about more than 50% at the moment. And in some areas, you will be seeing higher prices than that. I mean, those are kind of broad aggregates of pricing, and you'll see more acute action occurring in certain places. Wheat, as I said, is a really big one. It's so integral. I mean, think about the number of things that you eat that involve wheat. Obviously, bread being the number one. It's a staple of food across the world. One of the most worrying stats we've heard recently was Sarah Menker, who runs an agricultural analysis firm called Grow Intelligence, and she was speaking to the United Nations Security Council overnight, and she said she thinks there's only about 10 weeks worth of wheat for human consumption left in global stockpiles, which is about 50% less than most governments have been predicting that there was. It's a very worrying statistic. She said this isn't cyclical, this is seismic. It's a once in a generation occurrence that can dramatically reshape the geopolitical era. And obviously, we've seen in the UK these cost of living pressures spilling out, the amount of disruption they can cause, the large amount of political pressure that the government is under at the moment to act on this. But the consequences are going to be, even more severe if you're in one of those countries that are even more reliant than we are on or even more at the mercy of disruptions to their supply than we are. If you cast your mind back about a decade ago to the Arab Spring, a core part of the Arab Spring was the food crisis that was going on at that time in the world. And at the moment, we're only beginning to see the beginnings of the disruption this could cause. The obvious place to look is Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka was already in a pretty dire economic situation before the invasion of Ukraine. But it's pretty clear that some of the disruption that's caused has been enough to essentially tip the country into chaos. I mean, they've had one government collapse. They're defaulting on their sovereign debt. And there are sort of protests on the street and warnings about starvation. So we don't have to look far in the world or far back in history to see just how big the consequences can be once you start to see this kind of alarming food price inflation.
And in reaction to this, are we going to see countries stockpiling? Is it going to get more isolationary, do you think? Or are kind of the big aid organisations putting plans in place to stop that happening?
Plans are being put in place, but it's always a difficult thing to do, because you can't just create more wheat out of nowhere. If it's even in years that are less disrupted than this one, wheat supply is hugely contingent on weather conditions in different countries and how different harvests perform. And that's actually a point I'll get onto in a second. In terms of stockpiling, it's somewhat hard to tell in the broad. I think we're suspecting that we're going to see more countries try and have some kind of import controls. So the most noted one that we saw recently was India announcing that it was going to put export controls on wheat, which it announced, I think, last Friday. And that caused a very sharp sudden reaction in global wheat prices. I mean, the benchmark in Chicago went up about 6% in a single day, which is as much as it's allowed to go up in a single day. And the reason that was so remarkable is that India isn't even a hugely big deal in the global wheat market. It doesn't export a lot of the wheat it produces. But just that fear that there was going to be even more supply being taken out of the global system was enough to cause a sharp reaction. And that shows just how tight things are at the moment. I mean, that there is no slack whatsoever in the global system, really, for any more supply to be lost. And the big danger here is that in the backdrop to all this, I mean, I'm sure Putin didn't have a sort of 12-month weather forecast out when he decided to sort of send his tanks into Ukraine, but it's a bad year for wheat anyway. So we've seen conditions for growing have been very poor in Europe, where particularly France is another big grower, and in the United States, which obviously is a sort of huge agricultural producer. So we're expecting, and I've been speaking to sort of commodity analysts about this recently, we're expecting the harvest to be bad anyway, on top of all these other problems we're having, on top of Ukraine being taken out of the system, on top of these export bans that may be coming in. And the worrying flip side of that is that one of the very few countries that is having a good wheat harvest this year is Russia. Russia has had good conditions for growing. It's recently taken out a lot of the growing infrastructure of its nearest neighbor. It's a very difficult situation, and we've seen increasingly these warnings that Putin is going to attempt to leverage the influence that he has over global food supplies to inflict further pain and ratchet up the geopolitical tension that surrounded this conflict. And it looks increasingly like that's going to be a potentially big area, that there are a lot of countries that are going to be very reliant on Russia for wheat this year.
And in terms of the countries which are reliant, we've seen today a very different commodity, but we've seen Russia banning Finland from, Finland being cut off from Russian gas. How many countries can freely trade wheat with Russia, or is that totally shut down at the moment?
In general, wheat is one that's sort of been left open. There are certain difficulties around the edge of this, basically, because you may have a country that doesn't actually have sanctions in place on Russian wheat, but perhaps the shipping companies that would normally serve that country have unilaterally decided that they're going to stop working with Russia. So it's never quite as simple as what governments are doing at a geopolitical level. In the case of Finland, as you were saying there, Finland's become here the sort of third victim of the sort of Russian cutoff that's coming in. So we previously saw a couple of weeks ago now, Bulgaria and Poland were both cut off because they refused to pay for Russian gas and rubles. And this all links back. I mean, one thing that we've been talking about a lot, so when I've come on, has been this idea of a Russian sovereign debt. Is there a looming Russian sovereign debt? And that's integral to this, because Russia needs to continue receiving rubles in order to kind of support the ruble at home, and it's very important to that element of Russia trying to sort of keep its economy working properly. The Finland cutoff it's significant, but it feels a bit like nibbling around the edges. I mean, the big important relationship is, more than anything, is between Russia and Germany, but also very reliant near neighbours that Germany has, such as Austria. Finland only gets about 5% of its energy from gas. So although it's very reliant on Russia for that gas, it has other ways and means of providing energy to itself. So it's not, in the case of Finland, it's not a particularly huge shock that this has occurred. Finland is, as a country, quite well prepared to cope with it, and so it's more just indicative of this kind of. It's not a stalemate because things are moving, but just this sort of tense game of chess that's going on between the Kremlin and Brussels over, how and when is Russia going to wean itself off Russian gas? How and when might Putin cut the EU off?
Thank you so much, Louis. I don't know if we've got Colin back. I have just had a message from him, so hopefully he can be on the line. I was going to ask you about your story in the Telegraph this morning related to the emerging global food crisis and the Putin's blockade on the ports, which suggests that US missiles could be the key to unblocking these blockades. Colin, are you able to tell us a bit more about that? And
Yes, we're fine. By the way, those air raid alarms, they go off quite often. They don't generally mean that there's a plane flying right above you. It just means there's enemy aircraft detected in the general national or regional airspace. And after a while, people tend to just ignore them. It's a bit like hearing fire alarms in your office or whatever. So I've not been cowering down in a shelter or anything, nor has anybody else. To go back to the missiles, yes, US officials have been hinting that they might provide missiles called harpoons or naval strike missiles to Ukraine. These are missiles with a range of maybe about 200 miles or so. And as I understand it, I think the idea would be that these would allow Ukraine to directly engage some of the Russian warships that are currently participating in the blockade of Odessa and other ports. Now, there is a risk with this, however, that if it's one thing America or Britain supplying anti-tank missiles, things like that do make a lot of difference on the battlefield, but in terms of individual strikes on tanks or whatever, tend not to, attract that much attention from the Kremlin. But if you start providing missiles of this sort that can take out an entire battleship, that is a bit of a different game. And we saw the attention, for example, around the Moskva, the Russian battleship that was sunk about 6 weeks ago or so. If Russia started seeing that its flagship naval assets were getting downed by US supplied or Western supplied missiles, they might decide, look, hang on, this is NATO or the West getting directly involved in this conflict, and that could certainly ratchet things up. There was a kind of convention during the years of the Cold War on both sides that it was okay to arm, for say Russia to arm the communist countries to arm, say, the Vietnamese, or the Americans to arm the Afghan Mujahideen if they were fighting the opposite side. That you could get away with, but it tended to be sort of small arms kind of stuff. These kind of big pieces of battlefield kit are a bit of a step into the unknown. Then again, these could be used kind of defensively, and they could be used to sort of say, look, the Russian battleships need to get out of the way of our port, or we will use them by a certain date or something, and effectively put this in the Russian court, this ball in the Russian court, to see whether they would then respond. There's ways and means of deploying them so that it doesn't ratchet things up too much, but if it does happen, it's certainly quite an upping of the ante. I would have personally thought that they will also be making efforts to perhaps try and organise some sort of humanitarian food corridor. You would think that was not beyond the wit of people, given that they managed to do a humanitarian corridor from Mariupol down the road, getting civilians and fighters out. One would imagine it wouldn't be beyond the wit of humankind to organise a World Food Programme ship or convoy or something like that, so that essential grain supplies could be got out.
Thank you, Colin. That was very thorough and interesting. We've got one listener question that I want to get in before I know Dani has to run, and I'm sure, Colin, you're very busy in Ukraine as well. So the question is from Oliver. We do like to answer your questions on this podcast and Twitter space, so please do DM me or The Telegraph, or send us an email, podcasts@telegraph.co.uk, with your questions, and we can aim to get them answered. We do read all your messages. This one from Oliver says, with Putin and Gerasimov getting involved in really low-level tactical decision-making, does this make them more culpable in any war crimes that are committed by troops they are directly or indirectly ordering? I wondered, Dani, if you could give us a sense of just how involved maybe Putin is in these tactical decisions.
That's a really interesting question. It came off the back of a story we reported along with some of the other nationals earlier this week regarding a senior military source stating that Putin was so heavily involved in kind of tactical decisions that he was operating at a brigadier or colonel level, which I think most importantly shows the level of paranoia that the president is experiencing, to the fact that he is now having to get involved at low-level tactical operations. It really implies that he is incredibly aware of how things are not going to plan for him and what he had set out for Russia to achieve. And so he's having to micromanage. But on the point of whether or not they would now be more culpable for war crimes, I don't know. That's there's going to be lots of legal requirements within kind of penalising those that have been involved in such operations, and it's difficult for me to say if it makes him more culpable. But I think that war crime trials are going to be incredibly complex and long running. And to be honest, I mean, as an outside observer, he has overseen this whole invasion. So regardless to whether or not he's been involved in the more minute detail, I think it goes without saying that he will fall foul of having committed war crimes. So even if this element hadn't come to the forefront of what's happening on the ground, I still think he'll be highly punishable. I mean, he clearly has blood on his hands.
Thanks, Dani. Okay, finally, I want to switch over to Louis. I've just got one question for you. When you were here last on the podcast, we spoke a lot about the possibility of a Russian default. Now, I wonder if for our listeners, you could give us a sense of whether we're any closer to that default and what's changed since you were last here.
Well, Sophie, we're closer. We're not there yet, though. So since we last spoke, there have been some small but important developments. If you sort of cast your mind back to then, we were talking about the sort of possibility that the US could effectively engineer a Russian default. So what happened here is we have this exemption in place that basically allows Russia to continue making payments on its sovereign debt until the 25th of May, which is, as I look up at a calendar, is now very, very close, middle of next week. If the US were to drop that exemption by failing to extend it, it would basically mean that Russia is no longer able to make payments on its sovereign debt, and would then be on track for effectively a as I put it before, a default by default. There'd be no way of making those payments. They would then default about a month afterwards. A couple of question marks around that. So the first one is the first tranche of bonds that Russia has to pay after this deadline is next Friday, the 27th. Those bonds may be payable in rubles. It's a little bit of an open question at the moment. If they are payable in rubles, Russia may be able to make payments, but it's looking like either that tranche or a subsequent tranche that's coming in June is going to be the one that sort of brings Russia down. So the big question is still, is the US going to pull the trigger by effectively allowing this exemption to lapse? And we have pretty clear signals, not entirely clear, but pretty clear that they're going to. So Janet Yellen, who's the US Treasury Secretary, was in Bonn in Germany earlier this week on Wednesday, and she said, somewhat cryptically for those of us who have sort of following these things, the expectation was that it was time limited. She said in regards to the exemption. And she said, I think it's reasonably likely that the license will be allowed to expire. So that's kind of where we are with it. It's reasonably likely that the US is going to force Russia to default. As I said before, it's a bit academic at the moment because the US can basically pull, they can play this card whenever they want. So if they don't choose to do it this month, they might choose to extend the exemption for a few months further, and then they might engineer this default in the autumn or in a month's time or maybe in a year's time. I think the US is trying to hold this as a kind of threat over Russia. But it looks like at this stage, given Yellen's wording, that they do want to go ahead with it, in which case it's just another kind of form of sanction. And we spoke before about how a default may not have a strong immediate effect on Russia because Russia isn't hugely reliant on borrowing from international markets, but it could have a strong effect in the future when Russia is trying to rehabilitate itself. And more importantly, it could have a big effect if the sort of contagion and the reputational damage spreads from Russia as a state to Russian companies who are far more reliant on international debt markets. And we've just got an indication of how big that is today. So Bloomberg has crunched some numbers, and they've said that Russian companies have so far missed payments on about $14 billion worth of debt since over the last 2 months. So one of the big ones here was Russian Railways, which is a sort of big state rail company, was unable to make payments on its foreign debt or unwilling to. Lots of companies are in a similar situation. About 40% of them are in the finance industry, which shows just how strong those particular financial sanctions have been. So there is this problem building up. For now, there's been no coherent, coordinated action from Western bondholders to begin a legal case or begin any kind of major action to get that money back. This will end up in the courts eventually. But for now, we just see that this sort of default pile from Russian corporations is piling up. And though it's uncertain at the moment what that's going to mean, we can be quite sure that it's going to damage these companies' ability to raise funds in the future, as and when Russia begins to try and rehabilitate itself in the sort of global financial market, as seems likely it will eventually do. So, some changes on the default front. Some things haven't changed. We're still slightly waiting. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say Janet Yellen's language indicates that the US does want to bring about that default, in which case the clock will probably start ticking at the end of next week. But we're still playing a bit of wait and see at the moment.
Ukraine, the Latest, is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at thetelegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as this helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.